Welcome to the Global Missions Podcast, a show for Christ followers who want to participate more effectively in God's work, both at home and to the ends of the earth. Visit us at globalmissionspodcast.com to find show notes, resources, and previous episodes. You can also follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. This podcast is brought to you by the Global Missions Toolbox, a new online collection of practical, trusted resources made for those who support global missions from home. Visit us online at globalmissionstoolbox.com to register for access to this growing collection of tools for senders. And now, here's your host, Rob Magwood, better known to many friends as Mags.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back if you've been here before, and welcome aboard if this happens to be your first episode. And let me ask, have you shared this podcast with anyone? We'd be so thankful if you would help spread the news about this program. And remember, too, we're always glad to hear from you with suggested topics or guests. Today, over and again, you will hear an abbreviation, TCK. This is our short form for Third Culture Kids. It comes from the idea that children who move with their families do not grow up fully in their home culture, in our case, Canadian, or fully in their host culture, in our guest's case, Tanzania, but they grow up in between these two cultures, hence the idea of a third middle culture. Missionary kids, or MKs as we often call them, are an example of TCKs, and they are, understandably, the focus of our conversation today with Lauren. Moving between homes can be a very challenging experience for our children and our youth. Today we'll hear about how we, as sending churches and families, can support our missionary families so that they are better prepared and remain united throughout their ministry journey. I'll be honest with you, this episode is not all good news. We see some hard-hitting realities that can put our kids at risk, but we also see an opportunity for hope and intentional care as we approach the topic of caring for our missionary kids and their families. Our guest today is Lauren Wells, who is herself a TCK, who spent her teenage years in Africa, in Tanzania. Before we started recording, Lauren, we decided, well, it depends which language, right? If it's English, Tanzania. If it's Swahili, Tanzania.
Yep, exactly.
Right. East Africa. And now she is the founder and CEO of TCK Training. We'll unpack a little bit about that organization in a few minutes. She's the author of several books, including Raising Up a Generation of Healthy Third Culture Kids. She also sits on the board of TCK Accreditation and is part of the TCK Training research team focused on preventative care research in the third culture kid population. Lauren, welcome to the program.
Thank you so much. I'm glad to be here.
Just begin a little bit with your story, please, and how you came to be passionate about this topic of caring well for TCKs.
Yeah, this is definitely a topic close to my heart, something that I wouldn't be doing now if it weren't for my own life experience. I'm a missionary kid. So when I was 12, my parents told my little brother and I that we'd be moving to Africa. And so we moved right after I turned 13, and I ended up loving it. I wasn't sure about the whole idea before we moved. And then once we got there, I fell in love with Africa, and I was really integrated into the community and learned to speak Swahili and just loved my time as a missionary kid. And it was really hard. There were a lot of traumatic experiences. There were a lot of things that we witnessed that were really horrifying, and things that were a part of our life that I had no category for, being an American kid before that. And so we had all of these things coming kind of one after the other in this life that we were living, and seeing that everyone around us was going through the same things too, which makes sense. We didn't really know how to deal with all those things. My parents weren't sure how to help their kids process grief and trauma on the field, and we didn't know about debriefing. We didn't really have organizational support. And so it was definitely a situation where we needed care and didn't have it. And again, I was noticing a lot of the families around us were also in that same situation. So I came back for university and started studying child development and intercultural studies. And every summer I would go back to Tanzania to visit my family, and kept, again, noticing a lot of families on the field were really struggling. A lot of kids who'd come back for university weren't doing well. And there just seemed to be this underlying theme of a lot of really hard stuff and not a lot of resources to help. And so that was something that I became really passionate about. A few years later, I ended up working for an organization in Oregon after my husband and I got married and moved out to Oregon in pre-field training. So we were working with families before they went to the field. And that's where I started realizing I think we can be preventive about how we're caring for missionary families. I think we can put some things into place. And that's what started me on the trajectory of preventive TCK care, which is what TCK training was then built upon.
Wow, super. It's wonderful to hear how you've turned on some of the difficult experiences and now provide, I love preventative, out in front. How can we anticipate and better help serve organizations and families in particular, perhaps, to be better ready to provide and care for their TCKs? Tell us a little bit about the organization here, TCK Training. What's the vision for this organization? What type of services do you provide?
What we do is we work directly with families and their kids, and we also train organizations and churches and companies to increase the level of care that they're giving to families and children. And so we do things like debriefing families, but then we also have a debrief certification program to teach organizations to debrief their own families. And we have family check-ins where we can meet with a family on a monthly basis to just see how they're doing and keep up with them, especially those that are in high-risk areas or who have just gotten to the field and need additional support. But then we also train organizations and churches how to do those check-ins so that they can take that over too. And so we do both sides where we can either provide those services, but really our heart is getting those that want to be serving and caring for missionary families well, getting them really well equipped to care effectively for them.
Super. Well, I'm looking forward to learning more about TCK training here and just thank you for helping those of us who want to do a great job of caring for families, equipping families and caring for the kids. Well, I'm assuming it's 2021 because of the title of this, but the TCK Training conducted a survey, 2021 survey of developmental trauma in third culture kids. I'd like you to unpack that a little bit and what was included in this survey and what was the objective.
Yeah, one of the things that I have had on my heart for about a decade was to do research on the things that TCKs, third culture kids, experience and what the rates of those things are so that we know what we're preventing. And we're so intentional about being hope-filled in all of our messaging, but really saying we also have to look at the hard stuff to know what we're up against and to know the things that we need to be intentional about caring for and preventing. And so what we wanted to see is what the rates were for different types of developmental traumas and then how that impacted TCKs long term. And we used an ACE framework, which is Adverse Childhood Experiences, or ACE scores, because it's a research-based framework that's been used in many different populations. There have been over 80 ACE score studies done around the world on different populations. And so it was an easy way to compare what TCKs experience to other people groups and culture groups and that sort of thing, so that we had some sort of a benchmark for how common is this and what does it look like in comparison to the American population, for example.
Sounds like it would just give you a good context, right? A reference point for all of it. Yeah.
Yeah.
And so that was 2021. Is this a paper that listeners would have a chance to look at, or how can they learn from that?
Yes. There are 3 papers and probably 100 blog posts and articles and all sorts of things at this point. But tcktraining.com/research is where you can find all of that. Our white papers give the data behind some of the things that we were seeing. For example, one really difficult statistic that came out is that 1/3 of missionary kids said that they felt unloved and not special to their parents. And that was 1/3 of missionary kids, which is not something that we wanted to see or expected to see.
No.
We saw really high rates of emotional and physical neglect, of sexual abuse. 3 out of 4 experienced some sort of developmental trauma. So there were just a lot of things that were really clear that TCKs are at higher risk for some of these traumas. One of the things that we're looking at in the current white paper that we're working on that'll come out in the next month or so, it'll come out fall 2023, is looking at what were the risk factors. So how much did it increase the risk if they were on the field for this many years versus this many years? Or did it increase the risk if they had live-in domestic staff, or if it was a multicultural family, or all these different things? Because what we really want to do is be able to almost triage families and say, okay, if they have these risk factors that we know increase the chances of their children having developmental traumas and the negative impact of those, how can we be extra intentional about providing care for them and kind of pool our resources a little bit more to the families who would be considered high risk on the field?
Sure. Wow. I'm saddened to hear some of the learning that you did. And the numbers that you mentioned, not only are they serious things, the numbers are not insignificant. That's really striking and concerning. So thank you for helping to raise our awareness and our readiness to support families and kids. A why question here. Why do you think we're seeing these kinds of numbers and trends that you discovered in the survey data?
Yeah, one of the things that we continually see is that missionary kids have wonderfully loving parents who care about them, who want them to do well, but also that the entire family is thrown into really stressful environments all at the same time. And so it's at the times when the children's emotional needs are the highest that the parents' stress levels are also the highest, and they're away from any support that would be able to fill in the gaps. And so you create this perfect environment for the children to feel like my emotional needs are not met, I'm not loved, I'm obviously not cared about, even though that's not truth.
Right.
That's how they're interpreting that situation. And so what we see is parents really needing more support, especially in their first term on the field. When we're talking about risk, it's in those first 3 years that are the highest risk years. And so if in the first few years we can give them that additional support while they're working on building support in their actual location, that can be a huge preventive factor for the whole family.
Wow. Well, even these things, I mean, they make sense. There's a bit of common sense here that making adjustments to adapt and to settle into a new environment is going to be, let's use the term stressful. There are going to be stressors for the whole family. And if that's true, while a child has elevated needs, it could be misunderstood. And sometimes as you said, it's misunderstanding at times, but that's real, and especially real for the child. And the first 3 years, there are a number of things generally outside of TCK care, but the first 3 years are so very important for a family that's moving into a new context. And how do we as churches, as families, as agencies, make sure we provide the best possible support we can during that season? You said that it's those first 3 years. Does that mean, Lauren, in your research, that as there's stability that emerges over time and longevity, that those trends diminish somewhat?
Yeah, as long as there's some stability. So what we see is that high mobility is the thing that kind of disrupts that. So if they're highly mobile, then their clock restarts essentially because they're moving to a new location. We saw rates just soar exponentially when they moved over 10 times. And which makes sense. You're being thrown into that same high stress, high needs situation again and again. But that first 3 years, once you get through that, if you can maintain the community and there's some stability, even though there might be friends moving away, there might be home assignments, but there's some stability, some sense of I know how to do life here, and I know some people I can go to when I need it, and the parents have that support, then that increases the likelihood that they'll thrive on the field longer.
Right. Well, this is very helpful. And just speaking to our audience, these are not anecdotal observations that Lauren is mentioning here. This is based on statistical information and careful research. Some of it's not happy news. And I guess I appreciate having this conversation, even for the difficult points, Lauren, to help lift our awareness. I want to turn towards some practical ideas, even now, before we get to the break here. What are some practical steps that ascending church are like? TCK is broader than just MKs, friends. Missionary kids are a segment, a portion of these kids who may be embassy kids moving in government roles or military kids. We had other fun names sometimes for these dear young ones. But ascending church wants to do a good job. We'd like to take preventative measures to lessen negative impacts. What are some of the practical steps you can begin to recommend to us, Lauren?
I mean, the first and most simple is being that parent support, even from a distance. Mm-hmm. Sometimes it's easy to assume that they've started their new life, they've started a new community, they're doing well. And so we kind of pull back on our engagement and on our interaction with them. Mm-hmm. And we've had so many missionary families say things like, we don't even know if our supporting churches read our newsletters. We don't really hear back. And so we send them, but we don't know. And it's even that support of, hey, how are you doing? How can we pray for you? Asking those questions that helps them to feel like we still have people loving on us. We still have people caring for us. And they really need people who are filling them up. Because again, part of the problem is that they aren't filled up. And so then they don't have anything left to give their kids or their ministry if they're so stressed out in those first few years. And so trying to do things that fill them up can be a great thing. One of the things that was really great during COVID that some churches continued to do, and during COVID, some did really well and some didn't, was even inviting them to online Bible studies. Right. Yep. And realizing, oh my goodness, our women's retreat is online. We should invite the missionary women who we support. And there were so many who, in tears, just expressed how meaningful that was, that they weren't forgotten. And that when there was an opportunity for them to join in, they were given that opportunity.
All of these remote things that we needed to learn to do, maybe we did them before, but we got generally better at it, right? Mm-hmm. There's a silver lining here that could make accessible something that you're offering at your church that could be a great blessing to the women, to the men, to parents. Keep that in mind, that maybe there's a few time changes to work out, right? Time zones, but with a bit of creativity and care, that can be arranged for too. So that's a great mention, Lauren. I wonder if there are certain things that you would mention. We talk about being preventative. Is there anything that comes to mind before a family leaves for the field that we could do really proactively? I'm thinking we've got some families preparing even from our home church here in London, Ontario, and they're getting ready to go or to return to the field. What can we do in advance of their departure?
Yeah, one of the most effective preventive measures is that pre-field education and helping them to set up for success on the front end. One of the things that we talk about a lot is the idea of the red zone, and that's when we get stressed out and our brains are flooded with adrenaline and cortisol, and we're all not doing well. And some of the most effective things that you can do when you're in the red zone are putting green zone measures into place. But what we find is that you have to plan on doing that before you're in the red zone. And so having a plan for that and having a plan for, all right, every Friday night, we're going to have a really fun family night, or right after we get there, after the first 90 days, when we're still kind of deep in the red zone, we're going to do something fun as a family. But putting those things into place beforehand can be really preventive. Another part of transition care that's really important is understanding what normal transition stress looks like versus transition stress that really needs additional support. And that additional support doesn't necessarily mean intensive counseling or that they need to come off the field or anything like that. It just means that we're able to catch things sooner. Mm-hmm. And it's usually that the first few months abroad that either they do really well and they go through normal transition stress, or they're really struggling and really needed additional support and either get it or they don't. And so those are the examples of things that we can on the front end be educating about and saying, hey, this is what normal looks like. This is what you can expect to see in your kids. If you see these things, hey, reach out so we can have a conversation and we can see what things we can put into place to help you get going in the right direction.
Really good. We're going to ask Lauren to keep along this track of providing some practical ideas for us. She's got 2 more ways, especially to mention to us, in caring for TCKs and for their families. Before we continue our conversation, we'd like to share with you this week's featured tool that we hope will be helpful to you and your church.
The Guide to Starting Church Care Teams is a tool to help your church be more connected to the lives, needs, and ministries of your mission workers. Care teams can represent your church to the missionary and the missionary to the church. Care teams are a flexible model that work within the capacity of you and your church members. This tool suggests ways that your church could define a care team and what roles they could be responsible for. Find the Guide to Starting Church Care Teams in the show notes for this episode or by visiting globalmissionstoolbox.com.
Okay, we're back with Lauren Wells, the founder and CEO of TCK, Third Culture Kid Training. Lauren, before the break, you unpacked that first idea that we can be mindful as sending churches to really support families and parents during the first term, in particular, even at a distance. What's the next big idea you'd like to unpack?
Yeah, one of the things that we see to be really effective is to regularly check in with families, whether that's on a monthly basis or every other month. And what we see is that organizations agree that this is a fantastic way to support families and that would catch a lot of the things preventively along the way, but they just don't have the capacity to do that. On average, it's about 1 member care worker per 100 families, and there's no way that they'd be able to do that many check-ins on a regular basis and meet all of those families that consistently. And this is where we see that the church is perfectly positioned to provide missionary family care. And in a way, this is what the church is supposed to be doing. That's that pastoral care that they're supposed to be offering to the families that they have sent and that they're supporting abroad. And so what we would love to see is for churches to be taking on some of those family check-ins where they're regularly reaching out to families and asking, how are you doing? What's good? What's hard? What do you need right now? That they're equipped and educated to know what to ask, but then also when they're hearing things from families, what things should kind of perk up their ears that they think, I should ask more questions, or I should see what sort of resources I might be able to provide them or to suggest to them. And then looking for resources, maybe having a list of the things that you might be able to send their way when there are specific stressors that come along and that sort of thing. So we think that that's a really, really perfect opportunity for churches to support families well.
And Lauren knows already because she can see me. This is an audio recording for those of you listening in the podcast, but she can see my reaction when we talk about equipping the church to care for the mission workers. And it's a multiplier because every missionary family has a sending community around them, and to be equipped and trained. And you can hear that TCK is one of those places that can provide some resources. Maybe it will be helpful to follow up with Lauren and her team to learn more about what they offer. We will make sure, regulars know this, but we take show notes and you can find the links to the different resources we'll talk about and to the TCK Training website. You can check it out and reach out to Lauren and her team to learn more. Regular check-ins and letting them know that you care. And with those regular check-ins, if you have what is a standard, even when there are stressors, little bit by little bit along the way, you'll be better able to identify, wait, something is out of order here. Something is elevated. Do we need to add special resources or care in a particular way at this time? And that's best enabled when we have regular contact in a relational context. So, okay, I'm piling on here, Lauren. This is your story, but I just so believe in helping to equip the church to do what she is called to do.
Absolutely.
Okay, so regular check-ins. You've got another suggestion. Let's make sure we get to that. What's the next suggestion that you have that's practical for us as sending churches?
Yeah, the last suggestion is debriefing, and that can be informal or that could be formal debriefing. Informally, it's just making sure that we are asking good questions, especially to the kids when they come back, that allow space for them to talk about the hard things if they want to. We don't ever want them to feel like they're being pitied or drilled for the deep stuff, but we do want to make sure that we're not saying, oh my goodness, was it so awesome when you were over there? And not leaving any space for the hard, but saying things like, what was something that you really love about being there, and what's something that's kind of hard about being there? Or in reverse, what's something you love about being back here in the US, and what's something that's really hard about it, instead of, aren't you glad to be home? Or those sorts of things. So just giving opportunity for those, we call them ampersand questions, where there's a both and, there's a good part and a hard part. But then also formal debriefing. So one of the things we do at TCK Training is we do debrief certification trainings, where we train lay people to do debriefing at a really effective, high quality level. And that's another thing that organizations would love to do for all their families, but often don't have the resources, even if they do have trained debriefing staff. And so if we can get churches to be equipped to provide debriefs and then offer those to families, that could be a really, really fantastic resource. Now, we want to be careful with that, because if there's close personal connections, we want to be careful that we're not requiring them to debrief with someone who they feel closely emotionally tied to, and that wouldn't be maybe helpful. But with some really good protective measures in place, we think the church could be a really excellent form of debriefing.
Yeah, great observations. Just absolutely agree. Here, I'm just going to mention another podcast episode too. I don't know what number it is offhand. Check the show notes, but we so appreciate our friends at the More Network here in Canada who run retreats for TCKs who are returning, in our case, to Canada. They do it one in Western Canada, one in Eastern Canada every year, and they spend several days with workshops and sessions run by adult TCKs who themselves have been through transitions coming back to Canada, and they go out and they camp together and they do field trips together, and there's just a great time. Even though these kids are coming from different places around the world, they're all TCKs. And so they kind of speak that language. And the More Network, this is called the Reboot Retreat for TCKs. You can check it out on their website. We'll make sure it's in the show notes as well. Just one example of how we can come alongside in the debriefing.
We love the More Network.
Oh, you do? Okay, great.
You know,
Paul Dyke, Paul Dyke's dear friend, and himself an MK. I'm also going to mention our episode with Melissa Chapman and Returning Well, which is material especially designed to help debrief with grace and clarity from the church. Now, this would be for a generally healthy returning family to equip a church to do that. Sometimes special debriefs are necessary. We can help with that. But church, you can do this. And with some proper equipping and training, you can be a great blessing to your missionary families and to the agencies, to be honest, that we all serve together. Wow, we're just on the same wavelength here, Lauren, on so many of these things. Now, you have resources at your website, TCK Training. There's actually a tab at the top. Just quickly share, what kind of resources do you have on your website, and what will folks find there?
Yeah, I mean, we have everything from retreat curriculum for running TCK retreats. A lot of churches put those on, and so we have curriculum. We have trainings like the debrief certification training that I mentioned. We also have a family check-in training to equip churches to do those regular monthly check-ins with families. We have workshops that we encourage churches to even just know about so that they can send to a family. So if a family says, hey, we're about to go on home assignment and we're trying to figure out how to do that well, we have one on healthy home assignments that the church could just send along and say, hey, we went ahead and purchased this for you. So having workshops, curriculum, trainings on hand through our website can be a really great resource for you as you care for families well.
That's great. Are there other resources that you would mention to our audience? We'll make sure that the link to the TCK Training website is there.
Yeah, one resource that I think could be really wonderful for a church to be looking at is A Life Overseas. It's a blog that has a lot of articles from missionaries on the field, a lot of articles from those of us who work on the caregiving side, and it gives you a bit of a window into missionary life. And one thing that I've heard is that when people who are supporting missionaries are reading that blog, all of a sudden they're realizing, oh, this is what it's like. This is how their days are going while they're over there. And so I find that can be a really helpful way to kind of get your mind into the life of a missionary.
That's a great suggestion. Thank you. Lauren, if any of our guests would like to contact you or your team, what's the best way to go about that?
Yeah, email us at info@tcktraining.com. There's a number of us who check that email, and so it's going to be quickly replied to.
Very good. Well, I like to close with a typical question. Our listeners know this one, Lauren, but I'd like you to imagine, if you would, standing in front of a missions committee or missions leadership team, whatever it's called at the church. And the pastor is there as well. And this is a group that really wants to do a great job of TCK care and caring for their families. What would you like to say to that group?
It is our desire that third culture kids know and feel the love and goodness of God and how they're cared for. And you can be a catalyst that gets them to see that and not just hear it and not just be told that, but to really feel that. And that's something that you can do and are so perfectly equipped to do. And so I would implore you to go forth and do so.
Well, this has been a real blessing to talk with you today, Lauren. Thank you for taking time to share with us some of your experience and wisdom, and for building out a team and resources that could be so helpful to us as sending churches. May the Lord bless you, and thank you for being part of the Global Missions Podcast.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
Well, thanks for joining us for this important conversation today. Remember, you can check out the show notes if you think it might be helpful to take a next step in taking great care of our kids and their families. This podcast is brought to you by the Global Missions Toolbox. We hope you'll stop by our website and check out the online collection of resources. It's especially for senders, pastors, missions committees, and family and friends of workers sent out to serve in missions. Join us again in 2 weeks when we'll continue to explore this grand adventure of being Christ's witnesses to the ends of the earth.